नमस्कार दोस्तों, मैं अमिताभ and you are watching the School Times, a word with a word. Like always, last few weeks being a festive season in India, we have been broadcasting a special series, and that is 9 divine lessons in these 9 days of Navratri festival. Lessons that we learn from the i- incarnation that Ma Durga takes every day, with a belief that education, religion has an agenda, and that is education, and we emphasized on that. And that is why on last Saturday, we did not have our word with a word, because we were having 9 divine lessons. So we are back again with a word with a word. And friends, when we're talking about word with a word, right now we are broadcasting this show from the world's largest democracy, that is India. But then when we talk about online education, it's important to get perspective from different part of the world. And today, in a way, this is a special episode where we've got three professionals from the same university, from California. And we and the university is Bradman University, which from Orange County to New York, they have more than 27 campuses across. So it's a widespread university, and this university has a very distinct character because it is focusing in a big way on adult education, and that is where online also becomes one of the major forte for them, because they have their 27 plus campuses with a wide expanse, plus they also are providing that online support, and they have very advanced modules and systems with them. So we thought that it will be only pertinent to get some perspectives from the practitioners in the field, and get a dimension for the people who have been at a university level working on education with one of the major segments and their exposure in the online education itself. So the three resources that we have is we have Dr. Sheila Lakshmi Stenberg, who's Assembly President and full professor of Bradman University, Irvine, California. And we have Dr. Lata Murthy, Associate Professor of Sociology, Bradman University, again, Irvine, California. And we have Dr. Monica Shukla Belmonts, Assistant Dean Curriculum, uh, Assistant Dean Curriculum Assurance Learning and Competency-Based Education. And she of the School of Business and Professional Studies of Bradman University, again, Irvine in California. Friends, we have three people with the same university but different specializations in different segments. And as I mentioned, they are this university has a distinction and focusing on adult education, and online mode is definitely one of the strong fortes, and they have systems worked with them. So we will these are the resources that we have with us today to have a word with a word. And the theme that we are going to discuss and have a dialogue with the word is online education, future or fad. In these pandemic times, there's a lot of debate and discussion going on that is virtual going to be the new real? Or is online education going to be a future? Will there be hybrid, or will there be major shift from regular classroom learning to online learning? So is online learning future or fad is the theme on which we are going to have a dialogue, a word with a word. But before we get our resource to help us in this journey and developing insight into the theme, I would like to share a brief video presentation prepared by our team with the help of our resource today, which will give you a brief idea about the university they are from, about them, and online learning, the key parameters which we are going to discuss and debate today. Very good morning to you, because by your time standards, it is morning, and here it is evening. 7+ in the evening, and it is 6:30 plus in the morning there at your time. So welcome to A Word with a Word, and thank you so much for finding time so early in the morning to be with us. Sheila, Dr. Lata, Dr. Monica, pleasure having you here on our panel today.
Thank you.
Taking the discussion further, I would like to reiterate our theme for the day: to have a word with a word, dialogue with a word. Is online education future or fad? And we would have one round of opinion and take your perspective from each one of you, and then take our discussion and a dialogue further on the points that you raise. And I would request Dr. Lata Murthy to initiate by sharing her perspectives.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here this morning or this evening, depending on where you are located. And thank you for the question. It's a good question, because I think it's a question that's on everybody's minds right now, particularly at this current moment, as education globally is responding to COVID. And the uncertainty that it brings. So simply put, my answer is it is fashion or the future. The question is future or fad, not fashion or fad. I believe it is our future in one way or another. But I believe currently in many places it is being treated as a fad, because it has become our stopgap measure at this moment, and it's become crisis education at this moment. But I think once we can stop treating it as crisis education and as a significant component of education from here on out, it will become our future. I think that's inevitable. I think there will be an online component to our education at all levels from here on out after this experience. I think it needs to be implemented differently than it has been. So not as a last resort crisis stopgap measure, but much more intentionally for it to be a solid future for all of our students. I'm afraid you're muted, so I can't hear you at the moment.
Sorry, I was just pointing out that you have so beautifully given a perspective to us that it is, fashion, whether it is future or fad, we don't know, but it is definitely fashion for future. Online education, and I am latching on that tagline now. I'm going to use it many a times during this episode itself. And you also said that it is, given the context, the COVID context, the pandemic context, definitely it is here to stay, as you quite emphatically emphasized. You also said it has to be done more deliberately, rather than as a something that has suddenly come up and become more popular as a crisis intervention. And there has to be a more planned intervention, more deliberate effort towards it. Even before pandemic, online education did exist, but then it was not, it was always looked at as alternative. It is more like a continuing education rather than as a mainstream way to acquire knowledge and skill. I think that's where there is a need for shift, and that's what you're saying, that there's a more deliberate attempt needs to be done, and it is going to become fashion for future. So thank you so much for that perspective, Dr. Lata. Let us see that what our other panelists have to say, and then we have a dialogue, whether they also think it is going to be a fashion or they think it's going to be a fad. So I move on to Dr. Monica for your perspective.
Sure, thank you.
Education, future or fad?
Sure, thank you. And good evening, everyone, or good morning again if you're here in California. I'm definitely in my area. I think when I look at the business world, the way the business world works globally, we are definitely connecting virtually in the work world. So I think that having exposure to online learning, especially early on, will actually help our students globally to actually learn how to become better business professionals. So I see it being something that's going to continue in the future, while I also see the value of face-to-face education, like my colleague Dr. Murthy mentioned. Having this stopgap measure during this pandemic has been really critical, really instrumental to continue learning and education so that there isn't a gap in learning for our students. And basically having best practices we can continue to implement going forward will help to strengthen our online learning curriculum, our teaching skills, our ability for students to gain those skill sets that they can then use later in the workforce. So I see this being something going future forward.
Absolutely. So you do see a future in it, but then you also, as you quite rightly emphasize, that the value of the current education system, the current popular education system, that is face-to-face learning, that cannot be undermined, and how much the comparative efficiency of both these models of education or modes of education is something probably we need to have a dialogue on, that we need to weigh the relevance and how the two differ or complement or substitute each. I think that will be something very important to look at. So you do see that it may become a fashion for future, but then that does not mean that old is gold can be ruled out.
Exactly.
All right. Okay. That's the beautiful perspective. So I could already see that the perspective is building up into a dialogue, because we do have a dichotomy in the opinion, though we are all looking in the same direction with a different perspective, and that's what we want to understand and have a dialogue today. So let's understand Dr. Sheila Steinberg's perspective on online education, future or fad. Dr. Sheila.
Thank you so much, Mr. Amitabh. So my belief is that it's definitely here to stay. And the interesting thing is our university was engaged with online learning long before COVID hit. And so I think this is important to consider. We have built up the pedagogy and the approach for how do you effectively deliver courses to students, adult learners, in an online environment and keep them engaged and keep them interested and build a sense of community. And this is what we have a whole pedagogy around and that we focus on. And so when you begin at my university, even though I came in with many years experience as a full professor from the Cal State system, I had to go through a 3-week training course to understand this pedagogy of online learning and to understand the tools that we were using. So I was effectively trained and then have had mentorship throughout the process. But I believe that it's here to stay, and COVID is not going away anytime soon. And given the nature of the world, the globalized nature of the world, it really opens doors and, in my mind, increases accessibility for a lot of people to learn when maybe they wouldn't. Because you don't have to travel from point A to point B. You don't have to get on a train, a bus, or walk. But it does increase some issues of the digital divide and social inequality, which have to be examined because some people have internet access and some people don't. So I think online education can be great if it's done in the right way. Now, conversely speaking, our son is in high school. And in California, they've gone to this hybrid model where they're in class 2 days and the rest of the days they're online. And that's been kind of difficult. He says he'd rather just be online than go to the classroom 2 days and then have like 2 days online or 3 days online. That's actually kind of confusing for him. So I found that a very interesting observation from a 17-year-old. Yeah.
Right. So there are a lot of perspectives to understand, because it's not going to be as simple just saying straight away that online can be a future, because there's a lot of pedagogical issue, a lot of curriculum issue, a lot of acceptance issue, because different part of the globe has the socio-cultural factors are also affecting the acceptance, because a lot of people feel that online education is not a formal education. A lot of people think that it may not be as effective or as good as the face-to-face education, because these are the common perceptions, because people are used to a particular format for long. So migrating to a new format and accepting it will be an issue. And of course, how systematically the new format is planned is also going to be an issue. So let us take our dialogue further. And one of the first basic question, allow me to go with some very basic perspective, because that's going to help us and our viewers to get a lot of perspectives clear from your presence. And one of the very first question that is coming up when I talk in a social context, in a virtual mode or in a face-to-face mode in the last so many years, I feel that people are still very confused about two terms. One is online education and other is distance or correspondence education. Because a lot of people, so a lot of perception that people have about distance education is what they are, they're finding distance education and online education absolutely synonymous to each other. So I think I would like to begin with developing a clarity for our viewer and audience on that perspective. So I would throw this question to you, to our panel, for giving us that clarity and a perspective. So we go to Dr. Monica on that.
Perfect. Yes. Yeah. So when we look at distance learning, it's really that concept or that idea that there's some geographical distance that's created between that learning environment, between the student or faculty member and also the instructor there. So having that gap between the two, physically distanced, is what literally defines distance education. At the same time, there's a very clear distinction between correspondence versus online learning. And that's really that level of engagement, having a faculty or an instructor there who's really engaged with you, working with the students throughout the process, really making sure that they're delivering the curriculum in a way that is most applicable to the students' long-term learning goals and development. And when we look at correspondence learning, it's very much a little more self-paced on the student side, where they are the ones who are taking a little more leadership or ownership of their learning and education. They're going to be the ones reading the materials, the content, the context, and then reaching out to the instructor for more assistance and guidance. Whereas online learning is very similar to our in the classroom perspective of the faculty member is there teaching the students. It may be recorded lectures, it may be live lectures, so there's synchronous and asynchronous. So there's different opportunities even within the online sphere. And even within that, online can be subdivided into so many other types of learning as well. So different types of simulations or activities or cases, discussions, different modalities that you can use within the learning environment. But there's definitely a clear distinction between just distance learning, distance and correspondence, versus that online, which really has that clear engagement, both with the faculty or instructor and the student, and then also peer-to-peer engagement as well. So the connection between students.
All right. So when we talk about online education, are there various segments or types of online education as well? Are there variants within that?
Yes, yeah. And just to give you an example, for instance, our university, we have online curriculum. We also have something called our self-paced programs, our competency-based education, which is a newer future-forward model. And we were one of the first universities, we were, I believe, the fourth university to have financial aid funding for a competency-based program. The idea is that it would be a self-paced learner model. So students complete the same curriculum they would have on the traditional credit hour side, but they're able to go at their own pace. And this ties back to a lot of our students bring experience with them to the classroom, especially with adult learners. So with that andragogy model of looking at adult learning, what experiences they're bringing to the classroom, and in that case, would that help them to move through their curriculum a little bit faster because they have that knowledge to start? So that's something that's a new and different type of online learning model as well.
Absolutely. In fact, in our course of discussion, I think we'll come back and try and develop an insight into the difference between pedagogy and andragogy. I mean, how does adult learning and the K-12 learning model varies? Maybe that will be an interesting perspective to get an insight into. And of course, the synchronous and asynchronous model as well, how that gets interwoven in curriculum. So we'll get back to you and develop more insight into that. Going to Dr. Lata. Dr. Lata, when we talk about online education. Of course, you've been working on that, and I would like to understand two perspectives when we are talking how it is different for K-12 and how it is different in the higher education context. Because right now, whenever we are talking about online, earlier we were talking more online for graduation onwards. There were more number of courses for graduation onwards, and during this pandemic, suddenly K-12 has come into the this ambit of virtual learning, online learning, and suddenly schools have graduated to that model. We did not have so much of online education earlier in a K-12 context, which seems to be picking up as a big trend during this last 6 to 8 months time. So how do you see a difference between K-12 online education and a higher education online pattern?
So this is where in K through 12 education, I believe we're seeing online education as a crisis response, crisis measure, at least in K through 12 public education, in my experience as a parent and as an educator who does teach children at that level, off and on, but not full time. I'm in higher education. And so I see my two children, they're 9 and 12 years old. So in the 4th grade level and the 7th grade level. And it's interesting for me to watch their experience doing what is called distance education, but is both synchronous and asynchronous online education. So specifically, they're doing more synchronous online education than I do at Brandman University, where I teach completely undergraduate credit hour-based courses in sociology. And I may have 30 to 40 adult learner students per course, and very busy, working full-time, have families. And so the possibility of finding a time that all 35 of us can meet together virtually at the same time, synchronously, across time zones.
Right.
And as Dr. Sheila was saying, many of our students are military. Some are active duty military. They're
Right.
doing their work in other nations. So finding a time, just like the 4 of us, we're trying to find
Right.
a time
Absolutely.
for this program. It can be very difficult. So we do most of our work asynchronously, trusting that as adult learners, they've owned this decision to do their online, to do their education this way. They come in prepared for it being
Right.
online, and so they're ready to do that work independently. Whereas here we have our K through 12 students, they had no choice in the matter. We parents had no choice in the matter, and neither did the teachers in many respects. And so many of them were not trained. Like Dr. Sheila said, we at Brandman get extensive ongoing training in online pedagogy, best practices, andragogy, and our K through 12 teachers have not received that from what I can see. And they have been told, well, now you are going to teach fully online, really to keep your jobs during this COVID environment. And that's why I said earlier, it's being done as a crisis measure and not intentionally, deliberately with the right training. I truly believe that if it were done that way, intentionally, deliberately, with the training, much like we receive, then it would be a different experience for our K through 12 students right now. And some of the instructors I see are rising to the challenge admirably so, and teaching themselves, but they're doing it as they go. And it's very experimental at this point. And this is not just at K through 12. There are some higher education institutions responding in the same way as well, because they don't have the infrastructure that we've had at Brandman to do this from the beginning. It was not a deliberate, intentional decision. Last point, more specifically, what I'm seeing work well and not work well in K through 12 with online education is, so my older daughter has started junior high school, 7th grade level, where for the first time she has a different teacher for every subject.
Okay.
And I'm seeing that be much more effective through online, because the teacher can focus on one subject and teach it multiple times in an online format, both synchronously and asynchronously. Then there's my younger child elementary school 4th grade level teacher who is actually teaching a 4th, 5th grade combination class and has to teach multiple subjects. All online in different formats. And I see that being much more difficult without training. There has to be the use of many more apps. And then there are other schools, and I think Dr. Sheila could speak more to this from her son's experience, not the schools in my public school district in the Central Coast of California, but there are other schools that have gone to this hybrid model. Now at Brandman University, we learn hybrid as blended, where students, when it's not COVID times, students are in the face-to-face classroom one evening, 3 hours a week, and then the rest, these are undergraduate students, the rest is fully online.
All right.
So
this brings me to a realization while listening to you. And a perspective that I'm getting is that another issue that we need to dialogue and have an insight into is with age, as the children grow up, probably with maturity and individuality setting in, online becomes more effective because the students themselves can take responsibility of their learning. Whereas in the early years, the primary level, as you were mentioning, somewhere I think they are the learners themselves cannot take that full responsibility of their learning, and that makes the online even more challenging. And whether it will be effective in the primary years or not remains a question to be answered. And if it is effective, it has to be planned, and the ways have to be formulated. Pedagogy and curriculum has to be defined in a more structured way rather than in an ad hoc crisis management way. That would be very, very important. But that's what I think pandemic has given a new thought process to us, and maybe more new structures and formats are going to evolve. I've been saying on all platforms where I'm invited to speak that the last 6 months, the word has been a laboratory. We all have been researching with ourselves because we have been thrown into an unknown zone, and we are trying to evolve and trying to experiment in new ways. So a lot of new things are going to come up, and I hope something in this context also becomes even more refined and structured. But this brings to a very, very important factor. There's been a discussion that has been going on amongst parents and all, and a lot of people say that when we go for a face-to-face classroom experience, which was prior to lockdown was available to everyone. Again, we are in an unlock phase, so schools, colleges are again reopening. Now, there is a community experience that takes place. It's not just about the curriculum. It's not just about the syllabi. It is also about the experiences that people have, the children have. Those small little fights and the argument that they have prepares them for a bigger challenges in life. And they are deprived of those experiences right now. So when we talk about experiential learning, when we talk about experiences itself as a learning in the school environment, So that brings a question that how does online community work? I mean, is there a way, is there a science and a logic to it that we can create some online methods, online community that can simulate similar experience, or how does that work? And for getting an insight into that, I go to Dr. Sheila for giving us some insight into this perspective.
Thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question. And I believe that to really have effective online learning, you must create a sense of community. And if you do not create a sense of community, it's going to be more difficult for people to learn. And some of the ways that you create this sense of community that we do, that we're taught how to do, and some things that we've improvised as well, is engagement. It really centers around engagement. So simply because you are delivering a course in an online modality, it does not preclude the need for a teacher to show interest in each student, for a teacher to want to engage with those students. And we do that I think the best way is to triangulate your communication, to do it through multiple points of entry. So you can do it, if you're meeting synchronously, you're communicating. But then you should also set up additional meetings external to that synchronous meeting where you're engaging with your students, have time. Maybe it's office hours. Maybe you set up little small group meetings. I personally do phone calls with all of my students. I have a work cell phone, and I talk to them for 5 minutes at the beginning of the semester just to kind of establish a rapport. And then as we go, they are more likely to reach out to me later on. Also using things like breakout rooms if you're in Zoom, so come up with targeted, focused activities where students can get together in small groups. So it's not just always lecture. It's hard to maintain interest in a subject, you know this, Amitabh, if you're just talking at people. So making sure there's like a two-way flow of information is really central, and giving time for that interaction. And also for me, it's tying it to place. So if you can, as a teacher, bring concepts and tie it to a person's place of residence, it gives them the opportunity to go out, to do hands-on activities that relate to the material that they're learning in their own home community. So trying to connect them to their own community for the application of some of the knowledge that they're learning is another tool as well.
Okay. No, that's very intriguing. But this brings me to an issue like, how about we are able to take care of the academic quotient of the child, ensuring the curriculum and the learning goes on. Mm-hmm. How about the social quotient? How does, engagement is what you talked about. So one is the academic engagement, the two-way dialogue, and there is an interaction which is there. How about the social engagement, that the experience they get? Can an online community cater to social engagement as well?
It can by creating things like small teams, small groups to work on projects together, by enabling through the way that you ask questions on the discussion boards, getting people to introduce themselves to each other so they can see similarities. Oh, that person's like me. So when we do discussion boards, it's not always just content based. There, in the beginning of a class, we work very hard to establish rapport, etc. And I'm going to throw it over to my colleague, Dr. Murthy, who's very good at this and has some strategies as well. Take it away, Dr. Murthy.
Right, and I would like Dr. Lata. Dr. Lata, you would like to add on a perspective on this as well. Can we have your opinion on the same issue?
Yes, thank you. I think Dr. Sheila described it very well, and she was starting to describe project-based learning, which I think is also the future of online education. As far as the social component, that's where this hybrid or blended learning model I mentioned before really comes in, and research has shown that a hybrid learning model is really the best learning model. So it's partly online, where the student can engage on their own terms independently, and this includes at the K through 12 level, they can do this. But there is also the face-to-face component where they do come together, and it's also a flipped classroom model, which is I I believe, a newer best practice where when the students come together, it is not to be lectured at. It's not to have the instructor in the front of the room facing the students speaking to them. It's to come together in small groups and teams, work on hands-on projects together, much like the workplace, where the instructor is there to guide and to help. And then the instruction takes place on their own online through maybe pre-recorded lectures and other components online. But sadly, unfortunately, how I see hybrid learning interpreted now in the K through 12 system, again, in the crisis mode, is that hybrid has become teacher in the classroom teaching maybe part of the class, half the students socially distanced in the classroom, face to face, with the other half of the classroom logging in to watch the teacher teaching online. That's not truly hybrid, and I don't think you'll get that social component of hands-on project-based applied learning. But it's through the hands-on project-based applied learning that you build community as well, and that you have that engagement, so that there's the engagement both online and face to face.
So one thing is very clear listening to all three of you, viewers, audience. You are listening to Dr. Lata Murthy, Dr. Sheila Lakshmi Stenberg, Dr. Monica Shukla Belmont, and I'm your friendly psychologist Amitabh Mohan, and you are watching A Word with the Word, and we are having a dialogue on online education. In our discussion so far, one thing is very, very clear to me now, that when we talk about online education, it has a science of its own. It is not just replication of what was happening in the classroom is what now you're connecting on a Zoom or any platform of the same kind and replicating the same lecture. Online education is just not about that, because one thing which is common, whether it is face to face or whether it is online, is the learning outcomes. It's the learning objective. In both the models, educators, teachers are ensuring an appropriate learning outcome is ensured, and we are going to develop insight into it. It's just that method and the approach may be different. To reach to a destination, there can be two different paths, but destination is important, and that is not changed in either of the two model, whether it is face-to-face or online. It is just the approach and the method which is different, and there is a need for people to get more trained into the systems and the procedures, so that efficacy can be defined. And what our resource today said further emphasizes on the fact that we need to have a more defined parameters and systems, and people getting trained on that, and the learning outcome is the foremost, which we will be coming to discuss further. But before we take the discussion further, we have a very intriguing question from one of our viewers, and he's written two questions back to back, Mr. Kapil Agarwal, which says that what impact will online education have on schools with a huge infrastructure? In a K-12 context, this question is from Indian context, that there are a lot of schools with a huge infrastructure is there, owned by the private initiative, and now the infrastructure is there. If the online education comes in and replaces the regular schooling, so what will happen to these infrastructure is one question, and a rejoinder to that is that should we be prepared for schools with small infra, and what about huge investments on infra made by schools in the last 5-10 years in the current context? So I open this to all three of you for your perspective.
Sure, I can maybe take an initial stab on this question. I've actually studied comparative education globally, and I think that it is really interesting to see what happens with the larger educational system, the structures, actual infrastructure, buildings, and everything. Same here. We've had funding that's been put towards new technology and new classrooms, physical in the classroom, and now everything has gone digital, virtual, and online. So that is something that we're seeing right now. One thing that will make a difference is is the duration of this pandemic. So one item to consider is how long will this last? And based on how long it will last, will we see a return back to the classroom? Or like Dr. Murthy mentioned before, maybe some form of a hybrid where we go back to the classroom, but there's still an online technology component, because there is a value that I believe that instructors, parents, and students will see from the online learning modality as well. So I think that it's not necessarily the physical buildings will disappear, but it may just be that the format of the learning may evolve as we look at the future.
All right, perfect. And Sheila, would you like to add a perspective to that?
Sure, I would be happy to. And, you know, for me and a lot of the work that I do, I focus on social equity, like my colleague, Dr. Murthy, as well. And when we think about accessibility of education, I believe there will always be an aspect and a need for some face-to-face. We can never just, especially for our younger children, you know, they need to be in school. They need to have that. You talked about social interaction. There is no replacement for face-to-face interaction, but it has to be done in a safe manner. And being rash and just saying, no, the virus doesn't exist, we're just going to send the kids back to school, that's not a good approach. So I think as we go forward, we don't know what sort of challenges are on the horizon for the globalized world from a health standpoint or from a virus standpoint, but we do know that we have the technology and the capability and the infrastructure to enable people to learn in multiple ways and across multiple platforms. So what I see happening is there will be an increased division probably between the haves and the have-nots. Those who have great internet, who have fancy computer, can learn. Those who are poorer, more rural, that divide's going to be exacerbated. But there will always be a need for some physical infrastructure, especially in the rural environments. So I have a PhD in rural sociology, so I think about these things because you can use those as a hub. So potentially that becomes a place where the community comes together, where people come and they focus their learning from that particular hub to learn. But yes, there will always be, from this point forward, education as we know it has changed. The pandemic has changed that. You know what? We're not going back. We will never go back to straight up in the classroom 24/7 all the time. That is not going to happen. Forever education has changed. Yep.
So online education is a future, not a fad, but then face-to-face education is not going, cannot be done away with. There will be a more advanced interdependence that is going to evolve in times to come, rather than one taking over the other. So the larger infrastructures does not need to feel threatened about what they've created will be a waste, because that there will be no replacement to that, because it has an experience. Now this brings me to Dr. Monica, and about, Dr. Monica, when we're talking about online, we've understood what is online education. We've analyzed the pros and cons. We've understood the online environment and the community creation. Now this brings me to issue of what are the kind of best practices, the strategies in an online context? How do we go about that?
Sure, absolutely. And I think these best practices will work either at the K through 12, the lower levels, and also at the higher education levels as well. The first most important one is to focus on the outcomes. At that grade level, what outcome do you want for the student at the end of that academic year or that semester or even that month or week? So if faculty are able to really look at what the outcomes are and then scaffold their learning, that's something that we use heavily at Brandman University, is how do we teach students the basic skills so that they can apply them to the more advanced skills and then apply them to a real world context at every age level? How can we do that? So focusing on outcomes, scaffolding. The other pieces are understanding the resources and limitations of the students. So as Dr. Steinberg had mentioned, looking at what limitations the students have so you can most effectively communicate and reach out to them. Using really strong organizational skills is important. So making sure that the curriculum and the framework of how you're teaching, how frequently you're communicating to the students. So making sure you're regularly connecting with the students. And also another big one is checking in with the students who are maybe not progressing as quickly. So reaching out to find out what is maybe causing that gap in the learning skill set. Is it related to the technology or is it related to the concept? And so not letting students fall behind, because it's very easy in an online environment for students to just say, I understand. But then when they perform as an instructor, we can see they didn't understand the concept. So making sure that we are, as an instructor, proactively reaching out to the students, like Dr. Steinberg mentioned, connecting with the students via a phone call. Or another recommendation is midway through the course, checking in with the students to say what's working and what's not working, even if it's an anonymous survey, just to get some feedback on how the curriculum can be adapted to better meet everybody's needs. Creating community, it was mentioned before. Looking at the socioeconomic differences is important, and also really looking at each student's personalized learning needs. So how do students learn best? Because some are visual, some are audio, some are kinesthetic learners. So there's all different types of learning. So providing timely feedback that's really thorough, robust, and making that connection with the students so they feel open to reaching out are all best practices.
All right. When we talk about best practices, once again, I'm giving, will the strategy for online learning vary for K-12 and higher education?
So these best practices in an overall setting will work for both. However, there is that need to understand, you mentioned it earlier, Mr. Mohan, that when you have younger children, they need more guidance and help and assistance. When I think of, for example, 4 and 5-year-olds who may be in kindergarten, first grade, they may not know how to work a Zoom meeting. So right there, they would need some other type of adult guidance and help and support just to be connected online. And then to even complete their course activities, even if they have a printout that they're able to do, whether it's coloring or mathematics or anything, they need to have then other adults in the home that can help them to support their learning in addition to the instructor that they would have normally had in the classroom. So there are some differences that have to be taken into account based on the child's age and mental ability to handle that level of coursework and curriculum independently, in a sense. As you mentioned previously, as students are older and they can take more responsibility over their own learning, we can see that they can then be given higher level tasks. Another big component in curriculum is Bloom's taxonomy. So looking at moving away from just recall and memorization to really application, ability to create, evaluate, synthesize, that happens at the higher levels and stages.
Right. So, when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy in particular, and I'm throwing this question to you as well as to Dr. Lata, that, when we're talking about Bloom's taxonomy, how much is it applicable in an online mode, and how do you go about formulating strategy? When we are talking about developing the learning content or the learning outcomes with the level of learning that Dr. Bloom has defined, if we are trying to synchronize the learning objective, is it same as in online as it is in the face-to-face learning experience?
There may be some differences there. For example, presentations that may be done in person will have a different environment there, different context than a presentation done with a voiceover that's simply done for the instructor, for example. However, as we see from that business perspective of we're currently meeting via a virtual environment, engaging online through this virtual environment. So having that component, there's still some value to that as well. So having students engage and create and synthesize and present in a virtual environment still has strengths, just as you would have strengths in the face-to-face. But I'll go ahead and shift it to Dr. Murthy as well for her project-based learning perspective.
Absolutely. Now, this brings me back to Dr. Sheila. Dr. Sheila, you've been working with the cross-cultural communities as well, and when we're talking about, when we talk about online, we are not talking country specific because anyone can approach and access it from anywhere. Now, how much does one need to be tech savvy to avail of an online education? How much one has to be trained and equipped with the online formats to avail of online education?
So it's interesting that you bring this up, and I know you and I share a Rotary background together. And so when the pandemic hit, I immediately had to convert. I was president of my Rotary Club. And, Rotarians tend to be a little bit on the older side, 50s, 60s, 70s, some 40s if we're lucky. And I had to convert them immediately to online, but I teach online and I had to still maintain that sense of community online. So it was very easy for me to do that. But what it required was making sure I could have good communication with them separate from the online. So I had to make sure I did phone calls with them or talk to them somehow and say, hey, this is what we're doing. This is how we're going to do it. Do you have to be a tech expert to do online? No, you do not. I'm going to say that again. You do not need to be a tech expert. And if you look at our young people, I have the most faith in them because they are from little babies. They're on the phone and they're pressing things on the iPhone or the Android from babies. So the babies the younger people will be able to do the online. The systems, the platforms are getting extremely easy. So it's more that I think it's educating the older generation and perhaps the poorer folks who do not have access, but they could easily learn it. It's just providing them access and the tools, but the platforms are easy to use. And I'll turn it to Dr. Lata because she may have some thoughts on that as well.
Absolutely. And Dr. Lata, if you have anything, and with Dr. Lata, along with this particular aspect of ease of accessing the online education that we have, which Dr. Sheila talked about, how do you see on the technology side and in general about equity and access that online education provides to people? Because in India, there's a talk about a new education policy that has come up and getting implemented, where one of the major emphasis has been equity and access. So what is your take on that?
Thank you for the question. I've enjoyed watching several of the programs that you've done on the national education policy, and I thought the clustering aspect was interesting, and please do correct me if I misunderstood, but that private and then government schools are paired.
Right.
And I think this is where the private school infrastructure, if there has been a big investment in that, could come in. But there's the problem of transportation. I heard one of your panelists say, and that Dr. Sheila brought up too, if the child may be in a rural area at a government school is miles or kilometers away from the private school with the good infrastructure, then how do they take advantage of that? I think this is where the online component can come in. And I think Dr. Monica could speak to this from a business perspective. But financially, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think investing in online infrastructure in the long term saves money and doesn't cost as much as actual concrete physical infrastructure and facilities. Not that there isn't a need for that as well, but I think there's a lot of potential to reach students who otherwise may not be reached through online education, and that improves equity and access. But again, it has to be a deliberate, intentional, thoughtful investment on reaching these groups on their terms, in terms of their needs. And so I was thinking about your national education policy. I think online education opens this up not to be restricted or limited to the nation, not to be restricted to these certain clusters, but now all of us can take advantage of education globally. We can see what this program would not exist, right? Were it not for the online platform and online education, where we can all learn from each other. And there's incredible potential. And I think we need to see that and be optimistic about it. I mean, at the end of the day, online anything, it's a tool. It's a tool to convey our best practices. And Bloom's taxonomy was created well before online education took off. So online education is a tool, but equity and access are key. If you don't have access to the tool, then you will be left behind.
And that's a very, very significant aspect. And again, a very strong statement that you made, Dr. Lata, that is anything online is a tool, right? How we use that tool is very, very important. And if we use that tool effectively, online is going to be the fashion for future. And if we use that instrument in a right perspective. On the same context, we have one of our viewers, Meenu Seth. She has asked a question which is connected to what you just now said. Will online teaching not create a wider gap between haves and have-nots in developing nations like India?
I could take that.
Yes, Sheila.
Yeah, I believe the potential for the application and use and implementation of any tool has the ability to have this digital divide, which is a terminology we used to refer to, the haves and the have-nots having access to technology. I think, though, it sounds like the leadership of India is very cognizant of this and is taking forward steps that I have not heard of happening in the United States to do this private-public partnership to move forward. This is happening perhaps a little bit here, but it sounds the government is driving that over there. I think that's wonderful. That there has to be action and thoughtful policy to move that agenda forward so that the rural population and the underserved population in the urban areas do not get left behind. But that takes a commitment to something larger than the self, right? Service above self. Yeah.
Absolutely. And this brings me to another question by a viewer, Manoj Kumar Panda. How much is the remote proctoring technique effective for online assessment, Dr. Monica?
Sure, yes. I actually work very closely with our proctoring services. We have, for example, in our competency-based programs, they use a proctor track service. And we actually are able to see the students taking their exams. And so we're able to see it is the student. They actually also have a biometric scan that's done ahead of time. So we know it is actually that student. And then we're also able to flag and see on the back end if there were any disruptions, what was causing the disruption, whether it was, the doorbell rang or if the student actually left the screen, different types of different distractions that could occur. So we actually are able to check that with quality assurance as well.
In fact, maybe we'll come up with another episode just on how to go about doing online proctoring, because the whole world at the moment is talking about teaching is fine. How about assessment? How about evaluation of learning? And that's becoming a kind of a major concern. And maybe I would throw this question today to touch upon that. Maybe we'll have a episode dedicating to that and develop a more insight into the mechanism and technique. But then when we talk about online education, how do we go about evaluating the success of an online education?
That's a great question. I think it ties back to those outcomes. So are students actually measuring and performing to the outcomes that were developed originally from the start? So when you have those learning outcomes and objectives, did the students meet those objectives? And did you develop assessments that correctly measure those objectives? So definitely assessment is a big piece of that.
All right. Dr. Sheila, there's one term which has always intrigued me, and I would just like to understand if that has any connection with the online learning also, is GIS. When we talk about Geographical Information System, does that connect us with the education and online education also, Dr. Sheila?
Yes, it does, most definitely. So GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems, which is effectively spatial mapping. And, anybody who's using Google Maps to get from point A to point B sees that. And nowadays, the GIS that is coming out from the company Esri is traditionally it was in desktop mode for like the last, 30, 40 years. But now it has, in the last few years, it has become online. And so when we have designed we have 14 different programs that infuse GIS, business, social science, etc. None of them are in person. Every single one of those 14 programs is delivered online. But again, why are we able to do that? Because we deliver it in a hands-on applied manner. We teach the technology in a very user-friendly fashion. We do not require any prior knowledge or experience. So yes, there is a direct connection these days between learning GIS and in the online environment. Yep.
All right, great. Thank you so much for so many insight. we have come to the end of our today's episode. It's already an hour that we've been in an interaction together. Before we close the session and the episode today, your final word with a word on online education, future of fad, and we would like to begin with Dr. Monica.
Sure, just the last word. I believe this is the future. It's going to be the future, and it connects to the way we operate in business. And so those who can learn these skill sets, learn them early and practice them often, I think will have really great benefits.
Dr. Lata.
Online education will certainly become part of our future. And along with that, I think it will be a more student-centered education where there's not only proctored exams, but there's applied assignments where students are thinking and writing critically based on their own experiences outside of the online platform. And I'm excited about that direction.
Fantastic. Dr. Sheila, your final word with the word in today's episode.
Sure. My final word is online education is going to bridge the geographic divide. It's going to help create more networks and communities in rural, urban, and across the world. Look, we perhaps would not have connected up if it weren't for online education, and what a boon that is. So yes, it's going to strengthen us as a world, as a global environment, but we have to be mindful of issues of equity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to each one of you, Dr. Lata Murthy, Dr. Monica Shukla, Dr. Sheila Stenberg. Thank you so much for finding time and being with us in this journey to educate people, have a dialogue, and give insight to all the viewers. Thank you so much for being with us today. Friends, you were just now listening to Dr. Sheila Stenberg, Dr. Lata Murthy, Dr. Monica Shukla, all providing education to people across the world, and they are all in this university catering to education, Bradman University, with almost about 27 campuses across US, and with a distinct feature of working majorly in adult education, and what an insight that they have given. I have learned a lot. I'm sure you have the same feeling and experience, and listening to them, I think it is very, very clear that when we talk about online education, it need not be looked at as an crisis solution. It should not be looked at as because you're not able to go for a face-to-face education, only then you need to do online education. Online education is one of the ways and the methodology for ensuring education and imparting skills to us, and it should be more systematized. There is a need for defining the procedures, the pedagogy, the andragogy, creating training platforms so that the people who are imparting education are adequately trained, and then they are taking the education to people. The science has to be more defined, and the people need to be trained in that science, and accordingly we need to take it forward. And if we do it, our panel today, in a word with a word, has a verdict, and the verdict is online education is going to be fashion for the future. It is definitely there to stay. That does not mean that old system will be removed and replaced by online education, but from here onwards, we are only going to become more mature, more accepting of alternative methods of education available to us. If you allow me to draw an analogy, in a medical science, everyone used to run towards allopathy for long. Then gradually homeopathy started getting an acceptance, and then Ayurveda, and then naturopathy. Today, every science is being recognized and valued. I think the same trend and the pattern is going. This pandemic is giving a great impetus to online education, getting its due. And I think that's where we need to take things forward. So I once again reiterate, re-emphasize, our panel today says that online education is going to be the fashion for future, and it definitely is a tool which is going to reduce the geographical divide. People can have an accessibility to wherever they can get the education. On this note, thank you so much for being with us. You are watching the School Times, and right now I'm your host, Amitabh Mohan, your friendly psychologist, on a platform, A Word with a Word. Stay tuned every Saturday, 4 p.m. Today being a distinct day as we were cutting across the geographies, so we have changed the timing, but our standard time is 4 p.m. फिर मिलेंगे next week.